Good morning, Garden Oaks family. Hey, my name's John. If I haven't had a chance to meet you yet, glad to have you here this morning. Hey, if you got a Bible with you, go ahead and turn to Ruth chapter 3. That's where we're going to be this morning. If you don't have a Bible, there should be a Bible in the pew in front of you. And in that pew Bible, I believe it's page 223 if you want to kind of follow along there with us. And then we'll have the verses here on the screen, and you can follow along that way as well if that is easier for you. I think we all have things in our life, don't we, that we kind of wish we could go back and have a do-over, things that we wish we could do a little different if we had a second chance. You know, some of those things are big, consequential things. Some of them are little, kind of inconsequential things. But one of the things that I kind of wish I had a little bit of a do-over with is my marriage proposal to my wife, Christy. And the reason I wish I kind of had a do-over is because it wasn't really the most romantic proposal in the history of proposals. In fact, it was intentionally kind of anticlimactic and anti-romantic. And the reason is because both Christy and I are incredibly competitive people. And after we've been dating a while, she knew already that I had already bought a ring. She knew the proposal was coming at some point soon. But to be honest, I was kind of dragging my feet a little bit with the whole thing. And so she kept on saying, hey, you're not going to surprise me. I'm going to know exactly when the proposal's coming. Like, you're not going to catch me off guard. I'm going to know when it's happening. So I was like, okay, challenge accepted. I'm going to try to throw her off. So I kind of picked the day and everything, and I set up this date. I said, hey, get ready. We're going to go on a nice date. And so this was when we were living in Florida. So picked her up. We drove to the coast. We went to eat at what is probably our favorite restaurant in the whole world. It's really kind of small, intimate, romantic place on the coast. Like, we only went there on special occasions. So we went and ate there because, I'm sure in her mind, she's like, all right, if we're going to eat here, then it's happening tonight. And so we have dinner, but don't propose there at the restaurant. And then we leave the restaurant. I'm like, hey, why don't we go walk on the beach? And we never really do that. Like, I'm not a beach guy. Like, the sand getting in your shoes, like, I'm not about that. And so, that was a little different for me to just offer that. So, like, let's go walk on the beach. So we're walking on the beach. The sun is setting. I'm telling her how amazing and how special she is, how much I love her. Again, I want her to think it's coming, that I'm going to get down right there on the beach and propose to her, but I don't. We keep walking. And then I'm like, hey, I've got to get up early for work tomorrow, which was true. I had to get up really early the next morning. I'm like, I got to get up really early for work tomorrow, so why don't we go ahead and head back home? And you could tell, like, she's kind of frustrated and annoyed at this point. Like, what is this guy doing? He's never going to propose. So we drive back home. We get to her house to drop her off. I'm like, hey, I'll walk you to the door. So I walk her to the door, kiss her goodnight. You could see the frustration on her face. I'm like, hey, is something wrong? She's like, no, I'm good. I'm fine. That dreaded, guys, right? That dreaded, I'm fine. But, it's not. But she's like, I'm fine. And so she gets out her keys. She, goes to put the keys. She goes to open her door. I'm like, hey, what's going on? Were you expecting something else? She's like, no, I'm fine. And then as she's going in the door, I get down. I'm like, what, were you expecting me to ask you to marry me? And then, bust out the ring, and that was it. Again, I know, not very, thank you, Sisto. Thank you. Not very romantic, not very anticlimactic, but hey, here we are 15 years later, and at least most days, we are still madly in love with one another. So, yeah, say it's a win, at least for me. You can ask her later. This morning in Ruth, we're going to be looking at the story of another marriage proposal. Ruth chapter 3 really is a marriage proposal, and like mine, the proposal we're looking at today, it is not the most romantic marriage proposal you've ever seen. In fact, this proposal, it's a little weird. It's pretty awkward, and culturally, it's actually kind of backwards because in this proposal, we're actually going to see the woman proposing to the man. So if you're new with us or haven't been in a while, let me catch you up real quick on what we've been looking at the first two chapters of the book of Ruth. What's happened so far in the first two chapters of this story is we are introduced to this family. There's a husband, a wife, and they have two sons. And they're living in this town called Bethlehem, which was in Israel, but there's this famine in the land of Israel. And so this family, the husband, the wife, and the two sons, they decide to go move to the foreign land called Moab. So while they are there, the two sons get married to wives of their own. Everything seems to be going okay for a little bit, but then tragedy strikes, and the husband of the family and both of the sons all die. So Naomi, who's the wife and the mother of this family, she's left widowed. She's left without her two sons, with just her two new daughter-in-laws. And so Naomi decides, hey, there's nothing here in Moab for me anymore, so I'm going to go back home. I'm going to move back to my hometown of Bethlehem. So she sets out to head to Bethlehem. And what happens in chapter 1 is her daughter-in-law Ruth decides to actually leave her home of Moab and go back with Naomi to Bethlehem. And it is this beautiful story of love and commitment between this mother and her daughter-in-law. And Ruth, the daughter-in-law, says this beautiful line where she looks at her mother-in-law and she says, no, I'm going with you. And she says, wherever you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die. And so Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth, they journey to Moab, or they journey from Moab to Bethlehem together, but they're both widowed. They are both broken by the tragedy that they've experienced in life. They are both poor and vulnerable, living in the middle of a harsh and difficult world. And so chapter 2 comes, and what happens in chapter 2 is Ruth goes out and she is trying to gather some grain for her and Naomi to be able to have food, to be able to survive. And what happens is she just kind of happens to come across the field of this guy named Boaz, and the story tells us that this man Boaz is actually a relative of Naomi's. And this guy, Boaz, he treats Ruth with incredible kindness. He cares for her, he protects her, he feeds her, he sends her home each day with way more grain than she ever could have gathered for herself. He shows her just overwhelming, undeserved, incredible kindness. And so chapter 2 of Ruth ends by telling us that Ruth continued to go harvest grain in the field of Boaz. Throughout the rest of that harvest season, she would return to the field of Boaz to harvest grain. So that's the end of chapter 2. And as we pick it up in chapter 3, this is when kind of the romantic love story part of the book begins. So Ruth, chapter 3, verse 1, this is what it says. It says, one day, Naomi said to Ruth, my daughter, it's time that I have found a permanent home for you so that you will be provided for. Boaz is a close relative of ours, and he's been very kind to you by letting you gather grain with his young women. Tonight, he will be winnowing barley at the threshing floor. So Naomi says, Ruth, it's time we find a home for you so that you will be provided for. Now, here's the thing real quick, and if you want to write this down, because this is an important note to understand where we're going today. When Ruth says here, so that you will be provided for, that phrase, be provided for, it's one Hebrew word. It's the Hebrew word manoach, and the definition is it literally means a state or condition of rest. So what Naomi is literally saying to Ruth here is she's saying, it is time I found a permanent home for you so that you will have manoach, so that you will have a state of rest. You need a home so that you will have a resting place. Because up until now, Ruth's life hasn't been very restful. She's been going out every day in the hot sun, working her butt off just to scrape together enough grain for her and Naomi to survive. And so Ruth is saying, hey, you need a home, you need a husband who you can be cared for, who you can be provided for so that you can find a state of rest, so that you can have peace. That's what Naomi says to Ruth. And then Naomi says, hey, and by the way, Ruth, that guy Boaz, he's actually been very kind to us. He's been letting you glean in his field. He's sent you home with extra grain. And hey, by the way, Ruth, Boaz happens to be single and he's a close relative of mine, or in the original language, he's a kinsman redeemer. That's what Naomi calls Boaz. She says, Boaz is our kinsman redeemer. Now, we're going to dig more next week into what that means culturally in this day and age, but long story short, this idea of a kinsman redeemer, what it was it was part of the Jewish law in this day that if a woman's husband died and she was left widowed and she did not yet have any sons, then a near male relative of the deceased husband was to marry the woman and give her a son, but that son was not to take the name of the new husband. The son was to take the name of the deceased husband. And it was a way to ensure that the family line continued, that the lineage kept going. And it was a way to ensure that widows were cared for in this harsh society where not only women, but women who were widowed were incredibly vulnerable. So God put this idea called the kinsman redeemer into Jewish law as a way to protect these women who are in vulnerable situations. And so Naomi comes to Ruth one day and says, hey, Ruth, You need a husband. She says, 1, Boaz is a relative. That means he's eligible to be our redeemer. 2, Boaz is single. 3, Boaz owns a business, and business is good. Like, he's got a good job. He can take care of you. Naomi's like, hey, Ruth, are you seeing what I'm seeing here? Because it sure seems like Boaz checks a lot of boxes. Maybe Boaz can be the place where you find that Manoach, where you can find that place of rest. Why don't you go talk to Boaz? Any of you young single ladies, you got a mother like Naomi, right? Who, like, she's well-intentioned, but it just drives you crazy. You're like, hey, you see that guy over there? He's single, he's good-looking, he's a godly guy. Why don't you go talk to him? Like, Naomi, she's well-intentioned, but if you're Ruth, she can probably be a little much. But that's what Naomi's doing. She's saying, hey, Ruth, you need to find a home. You need a husband. Why don't you go talk to Boaz? And so what's going to happen next is this is where the story is honestly going to get a little bit sketchy. Because Naomi is going to cook up this plan to try to set up Boaz and Ruth. But again, her plan's a little weird. Her plan's a little awkward. The plan is a little sketchy. And real quick, before we read what her plan is, here's what we have to understand. Whenever we are reading the Bible, whenever we are studying the Bible, especially the Old Testament, sometimes the Bible is prescriptive, right? So sometimes we're reading the Old Testament and it's prescriptive. It's telling us what we should do and how we should live. Sometimes it's prescriptive. And then other times we're reading the Bible, especially the Old Testament, and it's descriptive. It's just telling us the unfiltered, true story of what happened at a certain place and a certain time. So for instance, like if you're reading the Old Testament and you're reading about Solomon, the king of Israel, and you read how Solomon has 700 wives. All right, guys, that is not prescriptive. Okay, that is not the Bible saying, hey, polygamy is cool, go out and do your thing like it was good enough for Solomon, so it's good enough for you. It is not being prescriptive, it's being descriptive about something that actually happened. And if you read into the context of Solomon, you see very clearly it's painting the picture that those 700 wives, they actually led Solomon away from God, not closer to God. So we have to understand, and as you study the Bible and read the Old Testament, like, think through that filter. Sometimes it's being prescriptive, it's telling us what to do. Sometimes it's being descriptive, it's just telling us the true story of what happened. So I think what Naomi suggests here next to Ruth, I think that's in the descriptive category. I think what Naomi's about to tell Ruth to do, again, I think Naomi is well-intentioned, but she's misguided. And she actually ends up objectifying Ruth. She puts Ruth in a very dangerous situation where Ruth is boiled down to nothing more than really a sexual object. But fortunately, because Boaz is righteous, he doesn't take advantage of Ruth, and God uses this situation to bring about good. So here's what Naomi cooks up. Here's her plan and what she tells Ruth in verse 3. She says, now, Ruth, do as I tell you. All right, it's going to get weird, I told you, so just buckle up. Do as I tell you. Take a bath, put on perfume, and dress in your nicest clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let Boaz see you until he has finished eating and drinking. Be sure to notice where he lies down, then go uncover his feet and lie down there, and he will tell you what to do. Now, if you're like, wait a second, there's got to be some like cultural context here that we're missing, like, because certainly Naomi's not telling Ruth, like, hey, put on some makeup, go get like your nicest dress, put some perfume on, get looking really good, wait till Boaz has a few glasses of wine, and then go lay down next to him. Like, certainly Naomi's not telling Ruth to do that. Yeah, that's exactly what Naomi is telling Ruth to do. Again, it's strange, it's awkward, I think it's misguided, but that's the instructions that Naomi is giving Ruth here. So this is what happens. Verse 5, I will do everything you say, Ruth replied. So she went down to the threshing floor that night and followed the instructions of her mother-in-law. After Boaz had finished eating and drinking and he was in good spirits, he lay down at the far end of the pile of grain and went to sleep. Then Ruth came quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. And around midnight, Boaz suddenly woke up and turned over. He was surprised to find a woman lying at his feet. Like, I love the comedy here. He wakes up and he's startled. He's like just completely confused. And now remember, Boaz knew Ruth. Boaz knows what Ruth looked like because Ruth had been harvesting grain in Boaz's field for an entire harvest season. So they knew each other. But again, like, you understand this if you've ever been woken up suddenly in the middle of the night, right? Like sometimes I'll be dead asleep and one of my kids will sneak into my room. I won't hear the door open. I'll just be lying there. I'm like completely passed out. And then all of a sudden there's a face right in front of mine and they go, Dad, Dad. It's like, oh, who are you? Like, what are your demands? Why are you here? It's like, it scares you. And then you take a step back. You're like, oh, you're my son. Like, why'd you do that? Stop being weird. That's what happens to Boaz. Like, he knows Ruth, but he's dead asleep. Like, he's had a few glasses of wine. He's asleep. And he wakes up, and suddenly Ruth's there. He's like, oh, who are you? There's a woman here. She smells nice. This is weird. Something's going on. So Boaz is confused. And so then it goes on. And here, in this next verse, here is where we begin to see the righteousness of Ruth. Because Ruth is actually going to now go off script from what Naomi has told her to do. Because again, remember Naomi, her instructions are, hey, get all dolled up, look as pretty as you can. You just go sit there, kind of bat your eyes at Boaz, and then let him tell you what's going to happen next. That's Naomi's instructions. But now Ruth actually steps up and she speaks and she actually takes charge of the situation. So who are you? Boaz asked. It says, I am your servant Ruth, she replied. And then again, she's not instructed to say what she's about to say, but then she says, spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer. Now this spread the corner of your covering over me, this is not some euphemism like to read between the lines. This is not Ruth saying, hey, let me climb into your bed with you. That's not that at all. What this is a marriage proposal. This is Ruth saying, hey, I want to be under your covering. I want to be under your wing. I want to be underneath your protection and your provision. I want to trust you with my life. That's what Ruth is saying here. And so Ruth, she is actually putting a lot of trust and a lot of faith in the goodness of Boaz in this situation. Because, again, here, Ruth is in a situation where if Boaz wanted to, he could objectify her however he wanted to. And they're out on the threshing floor, it's the middle of the night, and out in the middle of nowhere, Boaz can do whatever he wants to do, and Ruth won't be able to do anything about it. She is in an incredibly vulnerable position. She comes and she trusts the goodness of Boaz and says, you are my family redeemer. Let me come under your wing. Basically, will you marry me? And so look at how Boaz responds. Verse 10. He says, the Lord bless you, my daughter, Boaz exclaimed. For you are showing even more family loyalty now than you did before. For you have not gone after a younger man, whether rich or poor. Now don't worry about a thing, my daughter. I will do what is necessary, for everyone in the town knows you are a virtuous woman. He says, don't worry about a thing, for I will do what is necessary. So Boaz at first, I think he's kind of dumbfounded. He is surprised by this whole proposal. Because notice here, Boaz says, hey, you haven't gone after a younger man. So apparently Boaz is a little bit older. Boaz most likely is closer to Naomi's age than he is to Ruth's age. And so the story doesn't tell us, clearly, but reading into some of the context here, we can probably assume the reason Boaz has not made a move yet, the reason Boaz has not pursued a relationship with Ruth is because he is older than her, he's past his prime. He probably assumes that she would never be interested in a guy like him. Boaz assumes that Ruth is probably way out of his league. So Ruth makes the move. Ruth proposes, and I love what he says. He says, don't worry about a thing. I will do whatever is necessary. Right? Think about this. We are seeing there, with that response, we're seeing in real time that Boaz the Redeemer, that in Boaz the Redeemer, Ruth is finding that Manoach, that in Boaz the Redeemer, Ruth is finding that state of rest. Because think about Ruth's life up until this point. Every day was a day that is filled with worry. Every day for Ruth is a day filled with worry and anxiety. Worry about where her food is going to come from. Worry about where her protection is going to come from. Worry about if her and her mother-in-law will be able to survive. Every day is a day of worry. And here Boaz says, Ruth, don't worry about a thing. I've got you. You're mine now. Right, so here we see this story that begins in tragedy and suffering turning into this beautiful love story. But here's the thing. Again, if we step back out for a minute and remember where we're reading this love story, we're reading it in the Bible, right? You may have forgotten that for the last few minutes. We're reading this in the Bible. So then the question becomes, okay, that's great. This is beautiful and all, good for Ruth, good for Boaz, good for Naomi. But man, what in the world does that have to do with me and my relationship with God? And to answer that, here's what we have to remember. Jesus in the New Testament taught that the entire Bible, cover to cover, including the entire Old Testament, Jesus taught that it's all about him. Right? Jesus believed that, and we believe that here at Garden Oaks, that the entire Bible, Old Testament included, it's all about Jesus. Whether it's pointing to Jesus through the promises of God, whether it's pointing to Jesus through prophecy, whether it's pointing to Jesus through foreshadowing, the entire Old Testament is pointing us to Jesus. And so as we read Ruth, we have to ask, how is this story pointing us to Jesus? Now, next week in chapter 4, we're going to see even more clearly how this story is pointing us to Jesus. But here in chapter 3, here's how this is pointing us to Jesus. Because at the most basic level, here's what we are seeing in chapter 3. We are seeing that Boaz is the Redeemer through whom Ruth finds her rest. Right, remember, the chapter starts out with Naomi saying, my daughter, it's time we found a home for you so that you will have manoach, so that you will have a state of rest. And Boaz is the answer to that prayer. Boaz is the Redeemer through whom Ruth finds her rest. And so what this story is pointing us to this morning is that Jesus is our Redeemer at whose feet we find our rest. Just as Boaz is the Redeemer at whose feet Ruth finds her rest, Jesus is our Redeemer, and it's only at his feet that we find our rest. Right, that's what this story, that's what this chapter is pointing us to. That we find a resting place at the feet of Jesus, our Savior. Right, in the New Testament, Matthew 11, there's one day where Jesus offers this invitation, and he offers it to anyone and everyone who will receive it. He's teaching one day, and Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary, all you who are tired, all you who are burned out, all you who are worn out by this world, come to me and I will give you rest. Come find a state of rest in me. And so this story is reminding us that it's through Jesus that we find our rest. It's only at the feet of Jesus that we find our rest. Now, real quick as we wrap up, let me give you 3 different types of rest that I believe we are offered through Jesus. First of all, through Jesus, we can have actual physical rest in like the most basic sense that we think of it. Through Jesus, we can have physical rest. We can find rest from our bodies from work because we trust him to provide. Let me unpack this. But through Jesus, we find physical rest for our bodies from our work because we can trust him to provide. So Jesus teaches us, and the Bible shows us that it's ultimately God who provides for our needs. Everything we have, it's ultimately a gift from God. He is ultimately the one who provides for us. And so, that's part of why the Scriptures command us to take a Sabbath. That's why the Scriptures command us to one day a week cease from our labor, cease from our work. It's because, one, God knows our bodies need it. Our bodies need that rest, but it's also a way of showing that we trust God enough to know that even when we stop working, he will keep working and he will provide for our needs. And so that's why we're commanded to take a Sabbath, to take a day to cease from our work, to cease from our struggle. There was another time where Jesus was teaching, and he said, hey, don't worry about where your food's going to come from. Don't worry about where you're eat or going to drink or how you're going to provide your clothes. And then Jesus says, just think about the birds. Think about how the birds of the air have everything they need. There's always enough seed for the birds to survive because God, your Father in heaven, is providing for those birds. And then Jesus says, and think about how much more valuable you are to God than a bird. So Jesus says, so don't worry because God will provide. And so through Jesus, we can experience physical rest. We can stop. We can cease from our labor because we can believe that God is ultimately the one who is providing, and he will continue working even when we cease and we break from our work. So through Jesus, we can find physical rest. Another type of rest we find in Jesus is through Jesus, we find mental rest. With mental rest, we can rest our minds from anxiety because we know that Jesus is in control. Right? In that same passage where Jesus says, consider how God provides for the birds, he concludes that by saying, so don't worry and don't be anxious about tomorrow. And that whole command to not worry and not be anxious about tomorrow, it is centered around the fact that Jesus says, you don't have to worry about tomorrow because you're not in control. God is the one who is ultimately in control. Right, so this one is tough for me. The physical rest, I can do this. I'm good with taking a day off and turning it off. I can do that relatively easy. But man, this one is tough for me because I'm a pretty anxious person. And so if this one is tough for you, if you're a pretty anxious person, I want you to just think about it for a second. The majority of things that you are anxious about, the majority of things that you worry about late into the night, the majority of things that make your stomach feel unsettled, the majority of things that cause that anxiety, can you control them at the end of the day? The answer is most likely, most of them are things that are outside your control. Most of the things that we stay anxious about are things that we don't have control over in the first place. And so Jesus' invitation here is to say, hey, rest your mind from that anxiety. You're not in control, and while that may be hard to hear at first, Jesus, I believe, would say, but that's good news because I'm in control, and I love you, and I care for you. And so through Jesus, we can trust that ultimately he's in control, and he is after our good. He wants good for us. We can trust him with that control, knowing that he's in charge, and he loves us, and we can find mental rest for our minds. And the last one, ultimately, through Jesus, we can find spiritual rest. And this is the most important one that every one of us need. Through Jesus, we can find spiritual rest. We find rest for our soul from religion because he saves us. And listen, religion is a harsh slave master. Religion is a harsh master to follow. But through Jesus, we have rest from religion. Because see, here's what religion will do to you. Religion will tell you that you need to keep trying harder, you need to keep striving, you need to keep doing more so that God will eventually be approved with you if you do enough. The good news of the Bible is that the Bible tells us we don't have to work to earn God's approval. We don't have to work to earn our salvation because salvation or approval from God, it is a free gift of God's grace that Jesus has earned for us through his perfect life and death and resurrection, and all we have to do is receive it as a gift. That's what Jesus offers us. Rest from the harsh taskmaster of religion where we never know if we never measure up, or we never know if we've done enough. We can trust in Jesus and trust that he's done enough to earn our approval with God. So I'm going to invite the band to come back up, and we're going to continue worshiping through song in just a minute. But as they come up and as we close, I want you to just think for a moment this morning, is there a way that you need to respond this morning? These kind of three areas or these three avenues of rest that we are offered through Jesus: physical rest, mental rest, ultimately spiritual rest. Is there one of those categories where you need to come and find rest in Jesus this morning? So first, physical rest. Like, hey, are you just burnt out? Are you tired all the time? Are you burning the candle at both ends, just going nonstop 24/7? And if you answer yes to that question, then let me ask you a question. Are you making it a regular habit and a regular practice to take a Sabbath? To take one day a week where you cease from producing and you simply be. You simply exist. You don't check your email. You don't follow up on the project. You simply rest, trusting that even when you're not working, God is working. And I'd be willing to bet if you're burnt out, if you're tired, if you're exhausted, you're probably not making it a regular habit of doing that. But here's the deal, man. The Bible commands us to do it, but it's a good command. But we live in such a hustle-driven culture where, like, this isn't even a value. In fact, like, people who do this, we're like, what's wrong with them? Are they lazy? Do they not want to hustle? Do they not want a promotion? Like, here's the deal. Taking a Sabbath, it's actually one of the 10 commandments. Did you know that? It's like one of the top 10. Here's the sad reality. As your pastor, think about this. If I broke any other of the 10 commandments regularly, you should and you probably would fire me, right? If I killed somebody, if I committed adultery, if I lied regularly, if I stole, you would fire me. If I worked 7 days a week, you'd probably say, man, our pastor is such a hard worker. Wow. Right? We don't value this in our culture. We just don't, but God values it. And it's this great invitation where Jesus says, I know, come, just rest in me. You can stop. You can put the work down. You can trust that even when you are not producing, I will produce and I will provide for you. So do you need to trust Jesus and make this a rhythm of taking a Sabbath to find rest in him? Maybe do you need mental rest? Like, again, are you like me where you're just constantly like low-key, sometimes high-key, anxious all the time? You're just always worried about everything. And again, if you're like me, what's behind that I know in my life is I am trying to control things that ultimately I have no control over. And Jesus' invitation to us is, hey, lay down that desire for control. Lay it down at my feet. Trust not only that I'm in control, but that I'm good and I've got you. Or maybe do you need to find spiritual rest this morning? Have you been living in this state of life with this religious mindset where as you think about your relationship and your standing with God, you've assumed that the way you can get God's approval is to earn it through your good deeds and through being a more religious person? That's exhausting and you're never going to be able to do enough. So this morning you can find spiritual rest at the feet of Jesus. Lay down that idea that you can earn it and come and trust in him. Believe that he lived a perfect life that you couldn't. He died on the cross to pay for your sin, and he rose from death so that you could be forgiven and have an eternal relationship with God. And by simply coming and trusting in Jesus, you can have that. So let me pray, and we'll continue worshiping this morning.